January 1967, Toledo, Ohio. On the factory floor at Kaiser Jeep Corporation, just off Jeep Avenue on the city's east side, a truck rolled off the assembly line that looked like it had been dragged out of a civilian life and shoved straight into war. It wore the shape of a pickup, but only barely. A flat fold-down windshield, a canvas roof, a tubular brush guard shielding a bare steel radiator, a cargo bed unique to this model. 4 wide military tires forcing the front fenders outward at hard, unnatural angles. It looked improvised, it looked temporary, and really, that was exactly what it was. This was a peacetime commercial pickup stripped of its chrome and sent toward combat. Under the bonnet sat an engine the manufacturer itself had quietly discontinued 2 years earlier. In service, the frame would crack, the cab would twist over rough ground and jam the doors shut. In tropical heat, the carburetor could vapor lock and leave drivers stranded in the worst places imaginable. The critics, really, were right about every single flaw they identified. But the truth is, that did not stop this truck from serving in the jungles of Southeast Asia, along the Korean demilitarized zone, on NATO bases across West Germany, in the deserts of the Middle East, and in African conflicts that stretched into the 21st century. Even more remarkable, a Korean version of its chassis is still rolling out of a factory in Seoul today, more than 5 decades after the original first left Toledo. Its descendants have served in over 20 nations on 5 continents. Its designation was the M715. It was the first American military truck built from a civilian pickup. It was the vehicle that created a procurement model the Pentagon still uses today. And it was one of the most contradictory, misunderstood, and improbably consequential trucks in the history of the United States Army. To understand why the M715 existed at all, you have to understand the problem the American military faced in the early 1960s. At that time, the standard tactical utility truck across the Army was the Dodge M37, a 3/4-ton workhorse that had served continuously since the Korean War. Approximately 115,000 had been built in a production run that stretched to 1968. It was rugged, it was simple. In concept, it was close to flawless. But at its center sat a problem the Pentagon could no longer ignore. The Chrysler Flathead Straight 6 inside the M37 traced its design philosophy back to World War II. It produced just 78 horsepower at sustained highway speeds. The connecting rods had a tendency to fail. This was a truck designed to haul ammunition at walking pace, not to keep up with mechanized formations moving across Europe at speed. So the Pentagon began hunting for a replacement. Chrysler submitted a prototype, General Motors submitted a prototype, but both came back at roughly twice the cost of an M37, approximately $8,800 per truck. Both were rejected almost immediately, and the Army's real hope, in truth, lay elsewhere. It was pinned to a futuristic articulated 6-wheel drive truck called the M561, a machine already in development and sold to generals as the all-in-one answer to tactical mobility requirements. But in the 1.25-ton class, that truck was still years away from production. The Army needed vehicles now. Vietnam was escalating. The fleet was aging. Something had to fill the gap. That was when Kaiser Jeep Corporation, the Toledo firm descended from the old Willys Overland Company after Henry Kaiser's 1953 acquisition, offered something no military truck program had ever truly attempted before. They proposed taking their civilian Jeep Gladiator pickup, already in mass production, already proven on American farms and work sites, and militarizing it. The cost was the hook. The per-unit price would be approximately $4,400, half the price of any competitor. That mattered. On March 21st, 1966, the first production contract was signed. And with that, the M715 became the first tactical vehicle in the American M series to be built almost entirely from commercial, off-the-shelf components. That sounds bureaucratic on paper, but really, its implications were enormous. The transformation from civilian Gladiator to military truck looked cosmetic at first glance, but mechanically, it ran much deeper. The chrome grille disappeared, replaced by the tubular brush guard. The flat military windshield folded forward onto the bonnet, echoing the Jeep windshields that had crossed Normandy 2 decades earlier. A canvas cab top replaced the hard top. The civilian dashboard gave way to a flat military instrument panel. The front fenders were widened to accept 9 by 16-inch 8-ply military tires, and underneath, the changes went deeper still. The civilian axles were replaced with a Dana 60 front unit and a full-floating Dana 70 rear, paired with a steep 5.87-to-1 final drive ratio built for low-speed pulling power. A Borg-Warner 4-speed manual transmission and a 2-speed transfer case delivered 8 forward gear combinations and part-time 4-wheel drive. The engine was the Kaiser Tornado, a 230 cubic inch overhead cam inline 6, detuned from its civilian form to a compression ratio of 7.5 to 1. Official output, according to the Army Technical Manual, was 132.5 brake horsepower at 4,000 revolutions per minute and 198 pound-feet of torque at 2,000 revolutions per minute. That was nearly double the M37's horsepower. On paper, it looked like genuine progress. The payload was 2,500 pounds cross-country and 3,000 pounds on paved roads. Ground clearance stood at 10 inches. Maximum governed speed was 55 miles per hour. The fuel tank held 28 United States gallons, giving a realistic range of roughly 225 to 250 miles. Standard fording depth was 30 inches, rising to 60 inches with the deep water kit installed. A front-mounted winch rated at 7,500 pounds was available on most variants. 4 versions entered service. The base M715 served as the cargo and troop carrier, fitted with a canvas cover and folding bench seats for 12 soldiers. The M724 was a contact maintenance truck intended for field repair work. The M725 was a fully enclosed ambulance, capable of carrying 5 litter patients or 8 walking wounded, equipped with a surgical lamp, powered ventilators, a gas-fired heater, and blackout curtains. Then there was the M726, the rarest of the 4, designed as a telephone maintenance vehicle. Approximately 30500 units were built between January 1967 and May 1969. Production lasted less than 2.5 years. For a truck, the Army had positioned as a cornerstone of the fleet. That was an extremely short run. And the truth is, the critics had not yet even begun to deliver their full verdict. Before the truck ever had a chance to prove itself in full, events had already narrowed its fate. The M715 arrived in Vietnam in late 1967 or early 1968, during the peak period of American troop buildup. But what is striking, and really what shaped its reputation from the beginning, is that it did not arrive in anything like the numbers its specifications seemed to promise. The Army gave priority to Cold War deterrence. NATO bases in West Germany received them first. The reinforced American presence along the Korean demilitarized zone received them as well. Vietnam, the most active war zone of the moment, received what remained. That decision alone says a great deal. This truck was present in the war, yes, but not in the overwhelming numbers that define a battlefield icon. Veterans who served in country remembered seeing the trucks at rear area installations, at air bases, and inside headquarters compounds, not on forward combat patrols, not on the main convoy routes. One veteran writing on the dedicated M715 community forum put it bluntly: the truck served in Vietnam, just not in the same quantities as older equipment, because the older equipment had been there since 1965, and no one wanted to swap out proven vehicles halfway through a war. At Da Nang Air Base, photographs from approximately 1970 show M715 trucks fitted with M60 machine gun mounts and operated by United States Air Force Security Police. Even then, crews had already begun modifying them further. On some vehicles, the original canvas cab top was replaced by rough sheet metal, fixed permanently in place, while the rear of the cab was left open to let air move through. The tropical heat made the original enclosed cab almost unbearable. That detail matters, because it shows how the truck's design was being forced to adapt in the field, not through factory refinement, but through improvisation. The M725 ambulance, however, saw confirmed and meaningful service. A Navy corpsman attached to the United States Marine Corps in Vietnam later recalled being carried in one from a battalion aid station to the 95th Evacuation Hospital at Da Nang after being wounded. He described it in the simplest possible words, but those words carry weight. It was the vehicle that got him out. And yet, for every such moment of usefulness, the truck carried with it a long list of failures that were neither minor nor theoretical. The Tornado engine had already been discontinued in civilian Jeep models by 1965 because of documented reliability problems. 2 years later, that same engine was placed into a truck headed for tropical service in a detuned configuration that produced even less power than the civilian version. Really, that contradiction sits at the center of the M715 story. In Vietnam's heat, vapor lock struck repeatedly. A hot engine shut down, then restarted, could turn the carburetor into a trap. Fuel would percolate, the engine would flood, The driver could be left stranded in an exposed position at exactly the wrong moment. In a civilian inconvenience, that is frustrating. In a war zone, that can be fatal. The problems did not stop there. A rubbing block timing chain tensioner wore quickly, producing noisy valve timing and forcing constant adjustment. The overhead cam layout, modern in theory, created its own burden in practice. Mechanics trained on conventional pushrod engines were suddenly dealing with an unfamiliar design in field conditions where time was precious and mistakes were costly. Repairs that should have been simple consumed hours that forward operations could not spare. Then the structural failures began to pile on top of the mechanical ones. 1968 model trucks delivered to South Korea developed cracked frames at the factory welds. Kaiser Jeep was eventually required to hire a Korean contractor to repair several hundred vehicles sitting in depot storage. By 1970, many of the affected trucks were already sitting in cannibalization yards, stripped for usable parts. That is not the image of a triumphant new fleet vehicle. That is the image of a program already struggling to hold itself together. The cab, meanwhile, twisted badly on uneven ground. In some cases, the doors would jam shut during patrol. The rear leaf springs were so stiff that an unloaded truck rode brutally, hammering the crew over every imperfection in the road. Worse still, on broken terrain, the suspension could lift a diagonal wheel completely off the ground, killing traction at exactly the moment it was needed most. So the critics had been right. They were not exaggerating. They were not nitpicking. The flaws were real, and in service they became impossible to ignore. But then comes the turn in the story. The part that makes the M715 far more than just a failed military truck. Against all of those weaknesses, in South Korea the M715 found its true second life. Beginning in 1980, Asia Motors of South Korea began producing the K311 cargo truck, marketed internationally as the KM450. It was, in essence, a modernized version of the M715 concept. And what the Koreans did was so simple, so obvious, and so decisive that it changed the fate of the platform entirely. They replaced the Tornado gasoline engine with a diesel. That was the difference. The chassis remained, the Dana axles remained, the form factor remained. But the single component that had defined the M715's failures in American service was removed. And once that happened, the platform stopped looking like a liability and started looking like a legacy. South Korea today operates more than 1,000,000 KM450 family vehicles. The up-armored K319 variant, developed specifically for the Iraq conflict, deployed with South Korean forces in the Zaytun Division between 2004 and 2008. The basic platform had been made to work, not through some revolutionary redesign, but through the simple act of giving it the engine it should have had from the beginning. From there, the truck's reach spread even further. The Philippines acquired over 1,600 KM450 trucks for counterinsurgency operations in the southern islands. Ukraine adopted the KM450 chassis for the Bogdan-Bar's armored vehicle family and deployed them in active fighting from 2022 onward. Sudan, Mali, Niger, Colombia, Chile, Cambodia, Botswana, and Brunei are among the confirmed operators. Then came one of the most remarkable details of all. Sagol opened a dedicated assembly factory in December 2025. That means the truck the United States Army once regarded as temporary and inadequate is still going into production today. Not as a museum piece, not as a nostalgic restoration, as a living platform, still relevant, still manufactured, still serving. And that is where the M715 story becomes something much bigger than a simple list of defects. Because the truck that struggled in American service, the truck blamed for cracked frames, twisted cabs, brutal suspension, and an engine already known to be unreliable, did not vanish. It evolved. It survived. And in another country, under another name, it finally became the durable machine its original shape had always hinted it could be. The M715's immediate American successor was the Dodge M880 series, which entered service in 1976. Approximately 44000 were built. It too was a militarized civilian pickup. It was faster, it was more comfortable, and by most accounts, it was better liked by the men who had to drive it. But that is exactly the point. The M880 was the second truck to follow the commercial off-the-shelf model, not the first. After that came the General Motors Commercial Utility Cargo Vehicle Program, beginning in 1983 with approximately 7,000 Chevrolet K-Series trucks, equipped with 6.2-liter diesel engines. That program, in turn, gave way to the high-mobility multi-purpose wheeled vehicle contract awarded in March 1983, with the first vehicles entering service in 1985. On every straightforward comparison, the M715 lost. The M880 was cheaper to maintain. The Chevrolet program had a reliable diesel. The high-mobility multi-purpose wheeled vehicle outclassed it in every measurable category. But the truth is, none of those later trucks could undo what the M715 had already started. What the M715 created was not just a vehicle. It created a formula. A procurement model that cut the Pentagon's cost per truck nearly in half on its first major application became the foundation on which every later light tactical truck program would stand. Commercial components, civilian platforms, military fittings. That formula was written in 1966, and the American military has been following it ever since. That is the deeper legacy. Not elegance, not battlefield glory, influence. And then comes the deepest irony in the whole story. The Dodge M37, the truck the M715 had been designed to replace, outlasted it in service. M37S ran alongside M715S throughout the Vietnam era. Some stayed in reserve and National Guard units into the 1980s. The old flathead engine that had supposedly made replacement urgent turned out to be more repairable, more familiar, and more trusted in the field than the newer overhead cam unit meant to supersede it. That is a brutal verdict. The old machine, supposedly obsolete, proved steadier in the hands of soldiers than the new one that had been brought in to modernize the fleet. But the M715 was not finished. In fact, its most lasting recognition came not in uniform service, but in surplus. When the trucks began appearing at government auctions in the mid-1970s, civilian buyers saw something the Army had given up on. They saw a massively strong chassis. They saw a proven set of axles. They saw a form factor that was almost perfect for modification. The Tornado engine, tellingly, was often the first thing to go. Builders pulled it out and replaced it with Chevrolet small block V8 engines. Later came fuel-injected LS series units and Cummins four-cylinder diesels. The truck that had failed because of its engine became famous because of everything else. That reversal is one of the most fascinating parts of the entire M715 saga. Strip away the worst component, and suddenly the rest of the machine revealed its strength. The platform the Army had judged inadequate became beloved in workshops, off-road builds, and restoration communities precisely because its bones were so solid. Even Jeep itself kept returning to it as a design reference. There was the new Kaiser 715 concept in 2010, then the Crew Chief 715 inches 2016, and then the Anvil 715 at the 2026 Easter Jeep Safari in Moab.